The ashes of defeat, Germany after World War I. When World War I came to an end in 1918, the German army was not crushed in open battle. It withdrew from France and Belgium in an orderly fashion, still disciplined and proud. The soldiers who returned home were greeted as heroes, convinced that their military honor remained intact. Yet, behind the celebrations, Germany was collapsing from within. Years of war had drained its economy, its people were starving, and political unrest threatened to tear the country apart. In this atmosphere of defeat and humiliation, the Treaty of Versailles struck like a final blow. The treaty forced Germany to accept full responsibility for the war and imposed crushing reparations. It stripped the nation of its overseas colonies, valuable territories in Europe, and most importantly, its military strength. The once mighty German army, or Reichswehr, was limited to just 100,000 men. Tanks, heavy artillery, and an air force were strictly forbidden. But the German military tradition ran deep, a legacy built on centuries of discipline, organization, and tactical brilliance. Within the army, officers refused to let that tradition die. They saw the treaty not as a permanent defeat, but as a temporary restriction to be quietly overcome. During the 1920s, in secret and under the guise of civilian programs, the German military began to study new methods of warfare. Training continued in hidden facilities, often disguised as sports or industrial projects. Even after the fall of the German Empire and the birth of the fragile Weimar Republic, the idea of military renewal never disappeared. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he found a nation still humiliated by Versailles, but ready to believe in restoration. The army became the tool through which he promised to rebuild national pride. In his hands, that tool would soon become a weapon of conquest. The stage was set for the rebirth of one of the most powerful and efficient military machines in modern history, the new German army, known as the Heer, the secret rebirth of the German army. Despite the harsh military restrictions imposed by the Treaty of Versailles, the German army never truly disappeared. Its structure, discipline, and professional core remained intact, hidden beneath the surface of a seemingly weakened nation. In the shadows of post-war Germany, the army quietly prepared for a future return to strength. Throughout the 1920s, German military leaders sought ways to bypass the limitations of Versailles. They disguised military research as civilian projects and relied on secret agreements with foreign powers to continue training and experimentation. Cooperation with the Soviet Union was particularly significant. Under a covert arrangement, German officers and pilots trained on Soviet soil, testing tanks and aircraft that were officially forbidden in Germany. Within the ranks of the small Reichswehr, the best officers were carefully selected to preserve the army's professional traditions. They studied modern tactics, combined arms warfare, and the latest developments in technology. Although only 100,000 men were allowed to serve, the army's leaders made sure that each of them was highly trained and capable of leading larger formations when the time came. The government of the Weimar Republic publicly supported peace, but many within its military establishment never accepted Germany's disarmament as final. The army became a state within the state, disciplined, loyal only to itself, and waiting for the right political circumstances to rebuild. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, he found in the army both an obstacle and an opportunity. Most senior officers distrusted the radical new leader and his political movement, but they also recognized that his vision of national revival could serve their own long-term goals. Hitler promised to restore Germany's military pride and to break the chains of Versailles once and for all. Almost immediately, rearmament began. New tanks, aircraft, and weapons were developed under false names or classified as experimental models. Recruitment expanded far beyond the treaty limits, and conscription was secretly reintroduced. By 1935, Hitler felt confident enough to reveal what had been happening in secret for years. He announced the creation of the Wehrmacht, the unified armed forces of Nazi Germany, which included the Heer, Army, the Luftwaffe, Air Force, and the Kriegsmarine Navy. This act openly defied the Treaty of Versailles and shocked Europe. Yet, neither Britain nor France was willing to confront Germany with force. Encouraged by this inaction, Hitler accelerated his plans. The small and secret army of the interwar years had become a vast and modern war machine. The officers who had trained in secrecy were now the generals of a new, ambitious Germany, one determined to reshape Europe through power, conquest, and fear. The Führer and the generals, trust and betrayal. As Germany rearmed and prepared for war, a silent struggle for power unfolded between Adolf Hitler and his own military commanders. The army, known as the Heer, had a long and proud tradition of professionalism. Its generals were products of the old Prussian school, disciplined, aristocratic, and deeply committed to the military code of honor. Hitler, on the other hand, was a political outsider with no formal military background. His leadership was driven by ideology, ambition, and an unshakable belief in his own infallibility. At first, the relationship between Hitler and the generals was one of cautious cooperation. Many officers despised the chaos of the Nazi Party but supported Hitler's promises to rebuild Germany's strength. As he reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and seized Czechoslovakia without firing a single shot, his prestige soared. Success silenced most of his critics within the army. Those who had doubted his judgment now appeared foolish. However, behind the scenes, tension grew. Hitler began to distrust the general staff, the elite corps of officers responsible for planning and strategy. He saw them as relics of the old order, loyal to tradition rather than to him personally. In Hitler's mind, there could be only one supreme commander, and that was the Führer himself. To secure his control, Hitler reorganized the entire military command structure. The Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, which had traditionally overseen the army's operations, was gradually stripped of its authority. In its place, Hitler created the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, a new organization directly under his personal command. The generals now answered to the Führer's headquarters, not to one another. Those who resisted his growing dominance soon found themselves isolated or dismissed. The Blomberg-Fritsch affair in 1938 marked a turning point. Two of the most respected military leaders, Defense Minister Werner von Blomberg and Army Commander Werner von Fritsch, were forced out through scandal and manipulation. Their removal allowed Hitler to assume full control of the armed forces. Many officers understood the danger of Hitler's interference, but few dared to oppose him openly. His political power, combined with his early military victories, made him untouchable. The oath of loyalty sworn by every soldier and officer, not to Germany, but to Adolf Hitler personally, bound the army to him in both duty and conscience. Yet beneath the surface, opposition simmered. Some officers saw that Hitler's reckless ambitions would lead Germany into disaster. Among them was Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, the military intelligence service. Canaris quietly aided those persecuted by the regime and even conspired against the Führer himself. Others within the general staff would later join plots to remove Hitler, knowing the cost could be their lives. For now, however, the army obeyed. The once independent command structure of the German military had been transformed into a tool of Nazi power. The generals who had once guided strategy now carried out orders dictated by political will. And as Hitler prepared to launch his next great gamble, the invasion of Poland, the Heer stood ready to follow him into a new and devastating war. The oath and the Führer principle, loyalty above all. By 1939, the German army had been transformed not only in size and power, but also in spirit. The Heer was no longer the independent, professional force it had once been. Under Adolf Hitler, it had become deeply tied to his personal authority, bound by an oath that turned soldiers into instruments of his will. Every officer and soldier swore allegiance not to the German nation, not even to its constitution, but directly to Adolf Hitler himself. The wording was simple but absolute. I swear by God this sacred oath that I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, and that I will be ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. This pledge created a moral and psychological chain of command that went beyond traditional military discipline. The oath was personal, almost sacred, and it meant that disobedience to Hitler was not merely insubordination. It was treason. Behind this system stood the Führerprinzip, or Führer principle. According to this doctrine, Hitler's word was above all written law. His authority was absolute, and his decisions were not to be questioned or debated. In Hitler's Germany, leadership flowed downward from one man, and obedience flowed upward from millions. Within the army, this principle erased the last traces of independence. Senior officers who had once debated tactics and strategy were now reduced to carrying out orders. Some of them accepted this new order willingly, convinced that loyalty was their highest duty. Others obeyed reluctantly, fearing the consequences of resistance. A few, such as Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, embraced Hitler's dominance completely. Appointed head of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, Keitel became the perfect example of blind obedience. He supported Hitler's every decision, no matter how reckless or brutal, earning the mocking nickname Lackeytel, meaning lackey. Through men like Keitel, Hitler extended his control deep into the military hierarchy. When the Führer demanded ruthless action, Keitel and others transformed those demands into official orders. These included the infamous Night in Fahd decree, which authorized the disappearance of anyone considered an enemy of the state, and the Kommissar order, which instructed German troops to execute captured Soviet political officers without trial. Such orders shattered the traditional moral code of the German officer corps. Yet most soldiers, bound by their oath and shaped by years of indoctrination, carry them out. The concept of personal loyalty to Hitler had replaced the older idea of loyalty to law, honor, or humanity. Still, not all officers were at ease with what their army was becoming. Some quietly resisted, others looked away. A small number began to realize that their obedience was helping to build a regime that would ultimately destroy Germany itself. But in 1939, as the German war machine prepared to strike its first blow in Poland, the vast majority of the Heer stood united under one belief, that the Führer's command was beyond question. The oath had done its work. The army was loyal, disciplined, and ready for conquest. What no one yet understood was that this same loyalty would one day lead them to ruin. The architects of conquest, Keitel, Jodl, and the command of the Wehrmacht. As Hitler tightened his grip on the German military, he surrounded himself with officers who were willing to obey without hesitation. Among the most important figures in this new command structure were Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl. Together, they became the administrative and operational brains of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, the High Command of the Armed Forces. Wilhelm Keitel had once been a competent career officer, known for his organizational skills and quiet manner. But under Hitler, he evolved into something very different, a loyal servant who would sign any order the Führer placed before him. Hitler appreciated Keitel's submission and promoted him rapidly. Within the OKW, Keitel's word carried the weight of Hitler's will. He did not argue, he did not object, and he did not refuse. Working under him was Alfred Jodl, an intelligent and efficient officer who oversaw military operations. Unlike Keitel, Jodl was more analytical and capable of independent thought. But even he eventually accepted the system that demanded total obedience. Between them, Keitel and Jodl transformed Hitler's often emotional decisions into detailed military orders, ensuring that the entire Wehrmacht acted in perfect coordination with the Führer's intentions, no matter how irrational those intentions sometimes were. The result was a military command system that appeared highly organized but was deeply flawed. The traditional balance between political authority and professional military judgment was gone. Hitler's personal decisions now dictate a strategy, and his generals became executors rather than planners. When Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland in September 1939, the OKW's machinery functioned flawlessly. The campaign was swift and decisive, demonstrating the efficiency of Germany's new form of warfare, the Blitzkrieg. Tanks, aircraft, and mechanized infantry struck with incredible speed, overwhelming Poland before its allies could react. For Hitler, this was proof that his leadership was infallible. For Keitel and Jodl, it confirmed that obedience brought success. But as the war expanded, Hitler's interference grew more dangerous. He insisted on making operational decisions himself, often ignoring his generals' advice. Keitel tried once to question Hitler's plans for the invasion of the Soviet Union, warning that the objectives were too ambitious and the front too vast. Hitler exploded in rage. When Keitel offered to resign, Hitler coldly refused, reminding him that only the Führer could decide who commanded the armed forces. From that moment, Keitel's submission was complete. As the war dragged on, both Keitel and Jodl signed orders that violated the laws of war, the execution of hostages, the murder of captured commandos, and the destruction of entire villages in occupied territories. Each document carried Keitel's signature, a symbol of how deeply obedience had replaced conscience. For many within the Heer, this era marked the loss of the army's moral compass. The officers who had once prided themselves on honor and discipline now found themselves complicit in crimes committed in the name of obedience. The Wehrmacht, once the proud defender of Germany, had become an extension of Hitler's ideology. By the time the tide of war began to turn, it was too late. The architects of conquest had built a machine that could no longer be controlled, one driven by fanatic loyalty to a single man. The machinery of power, Hitler's control through the OKW. By 1940, the Wehrmacht had become a vast and complex military organization, and yet every major decision flowed from one man, Adolf Hitler. Through the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, he exercised absolute authority over all branches of the armed forces, leaving no room for independent judgment or dissent. In earlier German tradition, the General Staff, especially the Oberkommando des Heers, OKH, or Army High Command, had been the brain of the military, responsible for strategy, planning, and coordination. But Hitler's reorganization changed everything. The OKH was reduced to a subordinate role, its commanders forced to execute decisions made elsewhere. The OKW became the center of control, a tool through which Hitler could dictate every aspect of the war effort. Through the OKW, Hitler managed not only the operations of the army, but also the affairs of the Navy and the Air Force. Keitel served as his unquestioning executor, while Jodl translated the Führer's ideas into formal orders. The result was an illusion of order and professionalism, masking a system driven by political obsession and personal authority. The first real test of this centralized control came in the spring of 1940, when German forces invaded Denmark and Norway in Operation Weserübung. Traditionally, such an operation would have been directed by the OKH. Instead, it was planned and executed entirely through the OKW. It was a signal that Hitler no longer trusted his generals to think independently. He would control every move himself. After the success in Scandinavia came the lightning victories in Western Europe. France, Belgium, and the Netherlands fell in a matter of weeks. Hitler's prestige reached its peak, and his belief in his own strategic genius grew stronger. He began to see his generals not as partners, but as subordinates who existed only to implement his will. From that point onward, the war became increasingly centralized in the Führer's headquarters. Hitler held daily conferences where he personally dictated orders, sometimes down to the movement of individual divisions. He issued instructions directly to field commanders, bypassing the traditional chain of command. This micromanagement often led to confusion and resentment among senior officers, but few dared to speak openly. Nowhere was this interference more destructive than on the Eastern Front. During Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, Hitler repeatedly ignored the advice of his generals. When the German advance approached Moscow, he ordered critical divisions to be diverted north and south, depriving the main force of the strength needed to take the capital. The decision proved disastrous. The advance stalled, the Soviet resistance stiffened, and the dream of a quick victory vanished. Yet, even as the situation deteriorated, Hitler refused to loosen his grip. He dismissed commanders who disagreed with him and replaced them with men who would obey without question. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, one of Germany's most capable strategists, was removed for expressing doubt. Others followed, replaced by loyalists who valued obedience more than competence. By the middle of the war, the OKW had become a symbol of control rather than coordination. It no longer served as a strategic command, but as a mechanism for transmitting Hitler's will. The traditional German system, which had once encouraged initiative and flexibility among field commanders, was gone. What remained was a rigid, centralized war machine, powerful in appearance but increasingly paralyzed by its own leadership. The army that had once prided itself on precision and independence was now trapped in the cage of one man's ambitions. Command in the West, the generals under Hitler's shadow. As the war expanded across Europe, Hitler's obsession with control reached every front. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Western theater, where the German army, the Westwehr, was responsible for defending occupied France, the Low Countries, and the Atlantic coastline. Officially, this vast command answered to Oberbefehlshaber West, OB West, the Commander-in-Chief West. In practice, however, it answered directly to Hitler through the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW. From 1940 until the end of the war, the leadership of OB West changed repeatedly, a reflection of Hitler's deep mistrust of his own generals. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the most experienced officers in the German army, was appointed and dismissed 3 separate times. Others, such as Field Marshals Owen von Witzleben, Gunther von Kluge, Walter Model, and Albert Kesselring, were also rotated through the post, each struggling to command effectively under Hitler's constant interference. In theory, OB West was responsible for defending the Western Front and coordinating the vast network of fortifications known as the Atlantic Wall. In reality, decisions about reinforcements, troop movements, and even tactical responses had to be approved by Hitler himself. His paranoia and refusal to delegate authority crippled the flexibility of the commanders in the field. This interference became most destructive during the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944. Rundstedt and Rommel, both seasoned field marshals, understood that the only hope of repelling the invasion was to strike immediately before the Allies could secure their beachheads. But Hitler disagreed. He insisted that key panzer divisions remain in reserve under his personal command until he decided otherwise. When the invasion began on June 6th, Hitler was asleep at his headquarters. No one dared wake him. Hours passed before permission to move the armored divisions was granted, and by then it was too late. The Allies had already gained a firm foothold in France. Rundstedt, frustrated and powerless, famously remarked, "Make peace, you fools," a statement that cost him his command soon after. As the Allies advanced, Hitler continued to issue unrealistic orders. He forbade retreats, demanded counterattacks that were impossible to carry out, and accused his generals of cowardice when they failed. Even the most capable commanders found themselves trapped between military reality and Hitler's delusions. By late 1944, the situation in the West was deteriorating rapidly. Desperate to turn the tide, Hitler launched one final offensive, the Ardennes Campaign, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a bold but doomed gamble. The operation initially achieved surprise, but lacked the resources to succeed. Once again, Hitler's insistence on total control and his refusal to recognize strategic limits turned potential opportunity into disaster. As the Allies broke through German defenses and pushed toward the Rhine, OB West became little more than a symbol. The great army groups that had once swept across Europe were now retreating through ruined cities and burned villages. The generals, many of them disillusioned and exhausted, still obeyed Hitler's orders, even when those orders made no sense. By early 1945, the Western Front was collapsing. Field Marshal Kesselring, the last commander of OB West, inherited a hopeless situation. The war was lost, but Hitler continued to demand victory. Communication between headquarters and the front disintegrated, and the once formidable German command structure fell into chaos. The story of OB West was a reflection of Hitler's entire war. What had begun as a brilliant and efficient military machine had been reduced to confusion, mistrust, and blind obedience. The generals who had once shaped history now stood in the shadow of a dictator who refused to see reality, and because of that blindness, Germany's defeat became inevitable. The officers of the Heer, tradition, duty, and decline. The officer corps of the Heer had long been the pride of Germany. Descended from the Prussian military tradition, its members were known for their professionalism, discipline, and sense of duty. For generations, they had viewed themselves not merely as soldiers, but as the guardians of the nation's order and honor. Yet, under the Third Reich, this proud institution changed in both character and purpose. In the years before the war, the officer corps still reflected the old aristocratic values of the German Empire. Many of its senior commanders came from noble families, the so-called Junker class, who had served the monarchy for centuries. They valued loyalty, honor, and the idea of service to the state above all else. However, the massive expansion of the army under Hitler altered that social structure forever. As the Heer grew from a small professional force into an army of millions, the demand for officers skyrocketed. Aristocratic backgrounds mattered less than political reliability and battlefield performance. Officers were now drawn from all levels of society, middle-class professionals, factory workers, and even party loyalists. Some were promoted rapidly, not because of lineage, but because of courage or sheer necessity. At first, this democratization of the officer corps seemed to strengthen the army. It brought in ambitious, practical men with modern ideas. But as Nazi ideology spread through military education and training, political loyalty began to outweigh independent thinking. Officers were encouraged to see themselves as servants of the Führer's will, not as defenders of the law or of moral principles. The Führerprinzip, the belief that the leader's word was supreme, shaped the mentality of a new generation of officers. Debate and critical analysis, once encouraged within the general staff, were now viewed as signs of disloyalty. The officer corps, once proud of its intellectual tradition, slowly surrendered its independence of thought. Still, the old values did not vanish entirely. Many officers continued to believe in professionalism and honor, even as the war's brutality deepened. Some, like Field Marshals Owen Rommel and Fedor von Bock, maintained a sense of military ethics and resisted the most extreme Nazi policies. Others, such as Wilhelm Keitel or Alfred Jodl, gave up all moral restraint in favor of blind obedience. As the conflict dragged on and the losses mounted, the officer corps paid a terrible price. Leading from the front remained a deeply rooted principle in German military culture. Officers were expected to fight alongside their men, to share their dangers and hardships. This ideal produced extraordinary bravery, but also devastating casualties. By 1945, more than 16,000 German officers had been killed, many of them on the Eastern Front. The war also eroded the bonds that had once united the Corps. The constant interference of Nazi political officers, the growing influence of the SS, and the brutal conditions on the front lines fractured the sense of unity that had once defined the Army's leadership. In the final years of the war, as defeat became unavoidable, some officers began to question the purpose of their loyalty. A few joined resistance movements inside the army, culminating in the failed attempt to assassinate Hitler on July 20, 1944. Others chose to fight to the bitter end, convinced that duty demanded obedience, even in disaster. By the time the Third Reich collapsed, the officer corps of the Heer was a shadow of what had been. The traditions of discipline and honor that had once defined it had been corrupted by ideology and blind loyalty. The same values that had made the German army strong, obedience, unity, and sacrifice, had been twisted into instruments of destruction. The legacy of the Heer's officers would remain deeply conflicted. Some had served with courage and integrity, others had enabled tyranny and mass murder. In the end, their story became a tragic symbol of how a professional institution, when placed under absolute political control, can lose its moral compass and contribute to its nation's downfall. The soldiers of the Heer, training, discipline, and life at war. Beneath the high command and the officer corps stood the men who formed the heart of the German army, the millions of ordinary soldiers known as the Landwehr. They came from every corner of Germany, from farms, cities, and small towns, united by discipline, fear, and duty. For them, war was not a matter of ideology or strategy, but of daily survival. Military service in Nazi Germany was both an obligation and an honor. After 1935, every able-bodied German man was required to serve, usually beginning at the age of 18. The military service law declared, military service is an honorable service to the German people. Every German is liable to serve the fatherland. Later, as the war expanded and casualties rose, the age limits were stretched, first to 17, then to 60, and finally, in the final days of the Reich, to boys as young as 12. Training for new recruits was harsh and relentless. It combined physical endurance with absolute obedience. The first 16 weeks focused on fitness, marching, and weapons handling. Soldiers were drilled in tactics, fieldcraft, and discipline until they could perform every movement without hesitation. Punishments were severe, and even small mistakes could result in public humiliation or worse. The philosophy behind this training was simple: to create soldiers who would act instinctively under pressure and obey orders without question. The emphasis on endurance was extreme: long marches with heavy packs, sleepless nights, and live-fire exercises that often led to injury or even death. Instructors believed that hardship in training would prepare soldiers for the chaos of combat. Despite the image of modern mechanization, the Heer was not as motorized as many believed. Only about 1/5 of its divisions had full access to trucks and vehicles. The rest relied heavily on horses for artillery, supply, and transport. For many soldiers, the war was still fought on foot, with mud, exhaustion, and hunger as constant companions. The discipline of the Heer was strict, sometimes brutal. Obedience was treated as sacred, and failure to carry out orders could mean immediate execution. Desertion, retreat without permission, or even expressions of doubt were punishable by death. This severity maintained order, but it also created a climate of fear. As the war dragged on and conditions worsened, soldiers faced an impossible choice: obey suicidal orders or risk being executed by their own side. Yet, among the ranks, a deep sense of comradeship developed. Soldiers depended on each other for survival. In the mud and cold of the Eastern Front, or in the shattered ruins of France, bonds formed that went beyond ideology. For many, loyalty to their comrades mattered more than loyalty to Hitler or the Nazi cause. Daily life for the Landwehr was harsh and monotonous. Food was basic, often cold and insufficient. Sleep was rare. Letters from home were treasured, sometimes read and reread until the paper fell apart. Many soldiers carried small keepsakes, a photo, a medal, a religious charm, as reminders of the world they had left behind. Even in its decline, the Heer maintained its reputation for discipline and tactical efficiency. Its soldiers were well-trained, adaptable, and capable of independent action when necessary. This professionalism allowed the German army to continue fighting effectively long after the war was lost. but the cost was immense. Between 1939 and 1945, the Heer reached a peak strength of nearly 10 million men. Of these, more than 4 million were killed, and hundreds of thousands more were captured or wounded. Behind every battle, every victory, and every retreat stood these ordinary soldiers, men who fought in the name of a cause they often barely understood, caught between pride, fear, and survival. By 1945, the Lancer had fought on every front, from the deserts of North Africa to the frozen steppes of Russia. Many died believing they were defending their homeland. Others saw the truth only too late, that their courage and sacrifice had been consumed by a regime that led them to ruin. When the war finally ended, and Germany lay in ruins, the surviving soldiers returned to a homeland unrecognizable from the one they had left. For them, the war was not just a story of victory and defeat. It was a lifetime of loss, endurance, and shattered illusions. The final campaigns, collapse of the Wehrmacht, and the end of the Heer. By the beginning of 1945, the once mighty German army, the Heer, was a shadow of its former self. What had started as the most advanced and disciplined military force in the world was now fighting a hopeless war on two fronts. Its divisions were shattered, its supplies exhausted, and its soldiers weary beyond measure. Yet even in the face of certain defeat, Hitler demanded continued resistance. The structure of the Heer was collapsing under the weight of relentless pressure. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army advanced with overwhelming force, retaking every city the Germans had captured years earlier. In the West, the Allies pushed across the Rhine and into the heart of Germany. Communication between commands broke down. Entire divisions existed only on paper. What remained of the army fought in scattered, desperate battles, defending towns, rivers, and ruins that no longer held any strategic meaning. In Berlin, Hitler refused to accept reality. From his bunker, he issued impossible orders to units that no longer existed and demanded counterattacks from divisions that had been annihilated. His generals, too afraid to tell him the truth, continued to promise victories that would never come. Field marshals like Gerd von Rundstedt and Albert Kesselring could do nothing but watch the inevitable collapse unfold. As the front lines disintegrated, the character of the German army changed completely. Veterans fought side by side with old men and children pressed into service by the regime. The Volkssturm, a militia of civilians, was thrown into battle with little training or equipment. Entire units surrendered or disbanded, but others, driven by fear or indoctrination, fought to the last bullet. In the East, cities like Königsberg and Breslau became fortresses where German troops held out for weeks, surrounded by Soviet forces. In the West, the remnants of the Heer fought delaying actions in the Rhineland and Bavaria. Despite their hopeless position, many German soldiers continued to display remarkable discipline and courage, clinging to their sense of duty even as their nation collapsed around them. By April 1945, Berlin itself was encircled. The last organized formations of the Heer defended the city street by street. Tanks fought among the ruins, artillery shells fell day and night, and civilians huddled in basements as the Red Army closed in. Hitler's final orders demanded that no one surrender. But one by one, German units laid down their arms. On May 8, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The Wehrmacht ceased to exist, and with it the Heer, the German army that had once been the pride of a nation. Its commanders were captured or went into hiding. Some, like Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl, were later tried and executed for war crimes. Others took their own lives rather than face the consequences of their actions. The collapse of the Heer marked more than just the end of a war. It was the end of a tradition that had shaped Europe for centuries. The Prussian military system, with its values of discipline, order, and obedience, had produced both greatness and tragedy. Under Hitler, those same virtues had been twisted into tools of tyranny and destruction. When the war was over, nearly 10 million men had served in the German army. More than 4 million were dead, and millions more were wounded or imprisoned. The survivors returned to a devastated homeland, their cities in ruins, their families scattered, and their honor questioned by the world. Historians and soldiers alike have since struggled to understand how an army of such skill and discipline could become the servant of a regime so brutal and destructive. The answer lies not only in politics or ideology, but in the nature of obedience itself. The Heer was destroyed not just by its enemies, but by its own devotion to authority, by a loyalty that blinded it to the moral cost of its actions. In the end, the story of the German army in World War II is one of both power and tragedy. It demonstrated how excellence without conscience and discipline without moral restraint can lead even the greatest military force to ruin. From the triumphs of 1939 to the ruins of 1945, the Heer had marched with precision and pride, straight into the abyss of history.